Hello, this is Dale Beckman with the TrueWay.xyz. Today we're going to be tackling the thought, was Christ born of a virgin? That is, the Immaculate Conception. Did it really happen? What a question to ask, huh? It's probably one of the foundations of many Christian religions is that Mary, the mother of Christ, was actually a virgin upon conception of Christ, and that Joseph was like a stepdad. Okay. Hmm. But there's indications that actually that wasn't the case. Let's look at the clues. Let's dig into this because we know, like in the last video, that following truth, digging in, God likes that. He appreciates that. Let's look into this because, wow, I mean, it's inconceivable to some. And I know there's some videos out there that talk about this. We're going to go to the source. Okay. We have the books of Matthew, the beginning of Matthew, the beginning of Luke, which talk about the Immaculate Conception. But that's it. Why? I mean, let's find out why. Okay, because it's not talked about anywhere else in the New Testament that we have today. Okay, you would think that it would be talked about when Christ was defending himself, saying he was the Son of God. Why didn't he say, my mom was the prophesied virgin? Or when Christ was on trial, why did people know that, hey, Mary's that prophesied virgin that's talked about back in Isaiah? Why does it say it in Matthew and Luke and nowhere else? We're going to look at those thoughts, okay? But for right now, let's go back and look at the source. Isaiah, okay? Isaiah 7:14. Okay, here we have Isaiah going out to chapter 7. Oh, we can see that, chapter 7, verse 14. This translation uses God's name as Jehovah, or it's also known as Yahweh. But here it reads, therefore, Jehovah himself will give you men a sign. Look, the maiden herself will actually become pregnant, and she's giving birth to a son, and she will certainly call his name Emmanuel. It's very interesting here. Most people say, hey, it's supposed to say virgin, this and that, and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you what, we're going to dig into this just a little bit deeper, but let's first look at some of the children mentioned in Isaiah. Now, we do have, there is a chapter, a page in the TrueWay.xyz, and it's entitled Children Mentioned in Isaiah. Okay, hang on. So here we have a page on the website, the TrueWay.xyz, children mentioned in Isaiah. Now, it's interesting to see. I mean, we're looking at the context of here in Isaiah. Now, Isaiah talks about children, and they're used in prophecy. Basically, some short-term prophecy, some more long-term prophecy. Now, let's look at this here. We got children mentioned in Isaiah 7:3. I'm not going to try to say the name because I'll screw it up. But basically, it means a remnant shall return. Significance. says Isaiah's son is a living symbol of the hope that a faithful remnant of Israel will survive the coming destruction and exile. The child's presence alongside Isaiah when he meets King Ahaz serves as a sign of God's promise to preserve a remnant of his people. That's Isaiah 7:3. Now, we just read the one of Emmanuel, Isaiah 7:14, name meaning God with us. And it doesn't literally, it's it's a name. Okay, it's not literal. It's just showing that God is with his people. Significance: the child referred to as Emmanuel is a sign given to King Ahaz, indicating that before the child is old enough to know right from wrong, the threat from the neighboring kingdoms of Israel and Syria would be removed. The child symbolizes God's presence and protection over Judah during a time of political crisis. Scoot down, we have, let's see, those are footnotes. Now, I believe this is the Good News Translation. Isaiah 14a, the Hebrew word here translated young woman is not a specific term for virgin, but refers to any young woman of marriageable age. The use of virgin in Matthew 1:23 reflects a Greek translation of the Old Testament, made some 500 years after Isaiah. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind. Okay, Isaiah 8:1-4, another name which I refuse to try to pronounce, so I'll chop it up. But the main name meaning is swift as a booty, speedy as a prey. Significance: Isaiah's second son serves as a prophetic sign of the swift destruction that will befall the enemies of Judah, specifically the northern kingdom of Israel and Syria. The child's name is a warning that these enemies will soon be plundered by the Syrians. Isaiah 8:18, Isaiah and his children as signs. Basically, it says, here am I, and the children of the Lord is given me. We are signs and symbols in Israel from the Lord Almighty who dwells on Mount Zion. The child of Isaiah 9:6-7. This famous passage refers to a child who will be born, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This child is often understood as a future ideal Davidic king who will bring peace and justice. That's peace and justice. In Christian interpretation, this child is seen as a messianic figure, but in Jewish interpretation, it may refer, or does refer, to the historical figure King Hezekiah and or an ideal future ruler, which very well could be Christ. But anyhow, the child in Isaiah 11:6-9. This passage is part of the vision of the peaceable kingdom where the wolf will live with the lamb and a child will lead them. Pretty cool. The child in Isaiah 66:7-9. In this passage, a child is used metaphorically to describe the sudden and miraculous rebirth of the nation of Israel. Pretty cool, huh? But basically shows that Isaiah uses children as symbols, okay? Either future or present, short-term future symbols of things that will happen. So if you want know a little bit more about it, check that page out. Children mentioned in Isaiah. Now we're going to go back to Isaiah chapter 7 and look at that in a little bit more detail, okay? Now this is going to show that looking at the context is very important in understanding the real meaning of a prophecy. Now remember, Isaiah was written about 500 years, 500 to 600 years before it was translated. Okay, now the translation had taken that, the word here in the, like for instance, in the original Hebrew in Isaiah, and translated it into the word virgin. Now that the virgin is not, Well, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But anyhow, let's look at this context, okay? Now, King Ahaz here, he was dreading a couple kings, okay? He was scared. So anyhow, verse 14. I know we read this, but we'll read it again. Therefore, Jehovah himself will give you men a sign. Look, the maiden herself will actually become pregnant, and she is giving birth to a son, and she will certainly call his name Emmanuel. Verse 15. Butter and honey he will eat by the time that he knows how to reject the bad and choose the good. For before the boy will know how to reject the bad and choose the good, the ground of whose kings, that is, of whose two kings you are feeling a sickening dread, will be left entirely. So, the sign here was before this boy grew to a certain age, the kings that King Ahaz was scared about right now, they'd be gone. That's a sign. Okay. Back here, to review, we looked at Isaiah 7, the context of that, and this child that was to be born was a sign that God was with his people. The kings that King Ahaz was currently scared of, they're going to be gone. Now, there is nothing in the context of the original writing of Isaiah, the original, that indicates that this young maiden would be a virgin, or that it would be a miraculous future birth. Because remember what we had read in like verse 16, for before he's so old, these two kings that Ahaz was scared of, they're going to be gone. I wasn't talking about something that was going to be, hundreds of years in the future. This was relatively soon. But taking that into consideration, just imagine what would be in the mind of Hebrews, the Jews, up to Jesus' birth. Would they be expecting a virgin to give birth if it was originally understood that way? That Christ, the Messiah's mother, would be a virgin? When Christ was defending himself in John, he was saying that he was the Son of God. There was no mention, hey, my mom is that virgin that was mentioned back in Isaiah 7:14. No, the word virgin wasn't there in the Hebrew scriptures. It was only there hundreds of years later that the person interpreting it used the word virgin rather than just a young maiden. So let's keep that in mind while we go over this information. I'm going to play it, and I'll show you the screen. Hang tight.
To create a well-supported theological argument that both Joseph and Mary were the biological parents of Jesus, we'll explore the prophecy in Isaiah 7 verse 14, historical context, linguistic analysis, and scriptural patterns regarding children in Isaiah's prophecies. This approach will give a nuanced view of Isaiah's text and how early audiences might have understood it without the later doctrine of the virgin birth. Here's a structured approach with arguments. 1. Original reading of Isaiah 7 verse 14 from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Textual insights. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide some of the oldest extant manuscripts of the Hebrew Scriptures, including Isaiah. In the Great Isaiah Scroll, Isaiah 7 verse 14 reads similarly to the Masoretic text, "Behold, the young woman, Hebrew, Alma, shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." The word Alma here has historically meant young woman rather than virgin. Interpretation implication. The translation of Alma as virgin is a later interpretive addition found primarily in the Greek Septuagint, Parthenos, while the original Hebrew conveys a more general notion of a young woman, not necessarily implying virginity. 2. Date of original composition and context of Isaiah's prophecies. Historical context. Scholars generally date the book of Isaiah to around the 8th century BCE, during a period of crisis for the kingdom of Judah. The prophecy in Isaiah 7 verse 14 originally addresses King Ahaz amid a geopolitical struggle, giving assurance through a child symbolizing God's presence, Emmanuel. Contemporary meaning. In the 8th century BCE, prophecy was often symbolic and timely, focused on immediate deliverance rather than distant events. Thus, Isaiah's audience likely understood the prophecy as relevant to Ahaz's time, supporting the idea that it may refer to a natural conception rather than a miraculous birth. 3. Isaiah's use of children in prophecy. Pattern of child symbolism. Isaiah frequently uses children symbolically in his prophecies to communicate God's intentions and promises. Isaiah 7 verse 3. Isaiah's own son, Shear-Jashub, serves as a symbolic reassurance to King Ahaz of a remnant returning. Isaiah 8 verses 3 to 4, another son, Marshal-al-Hashbaz, symbolizes the imminent plundering of Syria and Israel, marking God's intervention in historical events. Emmanuel as symbolic child. In this pattern, Isaiah 7:14's Emmanuel could similarly be interpreted as a symbolic figure meant to signify God's favor rather than as an individual marked by miraculous conception. The consistent theme of children as signs in Isaiah supports the interpretation of Jesus as the biological child of Mary and Joseph, adhering to Isaiah's symbolic framework. 4. Original understanding of Isaiah 7 verse 14 and the meaning of Alma. The term Alma, in Hebrew, Alma typically denotes a young woman of marriageable age without explicit implication of virginity. Hebrew culture had specific terms for virginity, like Betula, which is absent here. The choice of Alma would suggest a straightforward meaning, a young woman, likely a future wife and mother, who will conceive a child in the usual manner. Original audience understanding. In Isaiah's context, the sign to Ahaz would not have implied a miraculous conception. Instead, it communicated a broader divine assurance that within a generation, the birth and maturation of a child, God's deliverance would be realized. This does not necessitate a virgin birth, leaving room for the view that Jesus, as Emmanuel, could be born from two natural parents, Joseph and Mary. 5. Additional linguistic and theological considerations. Septuagint translation influence. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures used by early Christians, rendered Alma as Parthenos, virgin, shaping early Christian interpretation. However, the Septuagint's interpretive choices don't always reflect Hebrew text meanings. By focusing on the original Hebrew, a biological parentage for Jesus fits within Isaiah's intended message. Theological coherence. Viewing both Joseph and Mary as biological parents aligns with the humanity of Jesus emphasized in several New Testament accounts, e.g., his genealogy in Matthew and Luke. It presents Jesus as fully human and subject to the lineage of David through Joseph, fulfilling messianic prophecies without requiring virgin birth doctrine. Summary argument. Based on the oldest textual evidence, Dead Sea Scrolls, and historical linguistic analysis, Isaiah 7 verse 14 originally conveyed a prophecy of hope through a natural conception. This would align with Isaiah's consistent use of children symbolizing divine action in immediate circumstances. The term Alma in the original Hebrew supports a reading of young woman without the miraculous implications later attributed to it. Consequently, early readers, viewing Jesus as a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, could regard Joseph and Mary as his biological parents without detracting from his messianic role, embracing the full humanity that aligns with Jesus' genealogical inclusion in David's line. This framework draws on historical, linguistic, and scriptural patterns to argue for a traditional conception involving both parents, Joseph and Mary, while maintaining theological depth and coherence.
Okay, so we've gone through and basically looked at the original meaning of this. Now, some people might say, well, what about Matthew and Luke? They have that virgin birth mentioned in there. Well, what's interesting is some church fathers, quote unquote church fathers, or commentators, have made mention that some Christians of their time had a version of Matthew that didn't contain the genealogy or the virgin birth account. And Jerome, who gave us the Latin Vulgate, he's a translator, he's a Bible scholar, did a couple things. One, he had written the Pope of his time and saying that we have to admit that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew. So we know that. And Jerome also goes to say that he asked to translate this so-called original Gospel of Matthew. He said he translated it into Greek and Latin, but we don't seem to have the copies anywhere. But he also mentioned, again, Jerome himself mentioned that there was no virgin birth account in that, which is really interesting. So it puts up to question, was that in there originally? And my guess is that it wasn't, but it was added later on to support that thought. There was a church father, Justin Martyr, lived around 155 to 160 AD. He wrote a dialogue called Dialogue with Trypho. And his thought was the translation of the Septuagint had more weight than the original Hebrew. And so that was the one to look to regarding this thought of a virgin. So again, Justin Martyr was looking at the Septuagint, at that idea of the virgin. However, Trypho responded that that wasn't the meaning of Isaiah back there, Isaiah 7:14, about a virgin birth. But anyhow, there was that dialogue back there. Back then, they're fighting over, if that really should be included or not. So there's been questions that have been recorded regarding that, which is really interesting, and especially for Jerome to comment that these early Christians did not believe in the virgin account. Very, very interesting on that. So there's a ton of information regarding this. Actually, just you can go into AI and look up a lot of this stuff. Of course, as they say, AI is not super reliable. You got to double check all this stuff. But I found that this stuff is actually really reliable, at least the information that I have given you. So, if we go with the oldest writings of Isaiah itself, there's no reason to even think that that young maiden would be a virgin. It's a totally different Hebrew word for virgin. The Hebrews, the Jews, they weren't expecting a virgin to give birth. They were looking at the Messiah coming. Sure, they had the prophecy of Daniel. Daniel certainly didn't talk about the Messiah being a virgin. There's no teachings of it with the Apostle Paul, or the other disciples talking about the so-called virgin birth. Now, they did talk about Christ being sent, coming down. Christ himself said that he was sent by his Father, and which is totally fine. So, and there's another thing too, for some people to say that, oh no, that, God couldn't have done it that way. Why couldn't have God done it that way, where Joseph and Mary both could be his biological parents, cementing Christ's lineage to be the future ruler of King David? Why couldn't have God done that? Are people putting limitations on what God can do? To me, the simple explanation is the virgin birth was made up, and it was supported later on with additions to the books of Matthew and Luke. But it's not necessarily a critical thing to believe, I don't think, but I believe that it can help someone appreciate things. Some religions will not want to question that so-called virgin birth because they have so much of their theology and their teachings, poured into this. Why would they want to make themselves look bad to others, like they were wrong? But actually would be a good thing, wouldn't it? Someone says, that's not what the original scripture said. There's nothing in Isaiah that would indicate that would be a virgin birth. Absolutely nothing. And this wasn't the earliest writings of an argument over this. Was the year 155. All the people that had literally seen Jesus and believed in him, they knew his family, they're all dead. The last video, I think we talked about how Christ told John to write a letter to these different congregations mentioned in Revelation on how these sects and different teachings were starting to infiltrate the congregation. John and John 1 and John 2. We had read some scriptures where that Antichrist or the deception was already starting back then. So this very well could be the oldest deception, major deception in Scripture that people are still believing today. Think about the images of Jesus Christmas and the Mary being a virgin. So anyhow, it's still pretty much ridiculous, at least to me. The original meaning back in Isaiah, hundreds, like 500 to 600 years before the first translation that we know of from in the Septuagint of Isaiah, and they mistranslated the word, but other people believed it. And the one gentleman I had mentioned, Justin Martyr, seemed to want to put more emphasis on the glory of Christ, and he was stuck on making that scripture, Isaiah 7:14, be a miracle of miracles about Christ. He refused to look at the original meaning of it. So, anyhow, there was a lot there, and I could have put a whole other hour of information on this subject. If you want to see more, I'll make another video on this concerning what the church fathers had to say about it, and that dialogue between Justin Martyr and Typho. So back in 155. Anyhow, I got to go to bed. You guys have a most wonderful day, and keep following Christ.